Thank you, Keogan, and you're very welcome this afternoon, Minister Helen. I was quite taken back by what you said in relation to private homes, and this is not hysteria. I've just read an article in the newspaper today, in the Irish Times, where a couple were fined €2,000 in our county because two Gardaí had looked in their window and seen a considerable number of people inside their house. I thought the private home was off limits, and we need to clarify that here today. To my mind, the private home is off limits for the Garda Síochána. Now, there is legislation there under the Environmental Act for noise pollution, and I welcome that piece of legislation to be used any time there is parties on in houses. But as far as I'm concerned, looking through windows to find people during this time in private homes is certainly not on. So I just want to state that now before I move any further. I was delighted to hear that the wet pubs will be permitted to open on the 21st of September. These pubs have been closed for 6 months at this stage, and given that September also marks the end of the moratorium on mortgages, it is timely to be taking action when many pubs may be facing the possibility of mortgage default or eventual permanent closure. While I welcome this bill in the general context, there are many aspects about it, and more particularly in the how and the why of its coming about, that I find worrying. There has been a distinct lack of clarity surrounding the bill as it goes through the stages. I am concerned by the scale of the powers in this legislation. They are very broad-ranging. The legislation sets out mechanism of enforcement for the Garda Síochána and the penalties to be applied, but does not appear to go into any detail about the actual crimes involved. Rather, we have been asked to accept the Department of Justice and Equality criminal sanctions as laid out, while the actual offences are set out or will be set out in regulation from the Department of Health. This is a failure of process. It is a dangerous path to accept such legislation. We can't know what will end up being criminalised by the Department. We cannot and should not allow legislation to pass with such vague information, especially when people's livelihoods are at stake. It is also concerning how rushed this bill has been. I am not oblivious to the time constraints involved here. But as it is often the case, when the appropriate processes are not followed, very often the legislative outcome is of poor quality. There have been inadequacies in the process relating to the legislation, particularly in that the legislation has been extremely rushed. Publishing a bill in advance, giving people time to consider it, and then further time to debate it properly, are all necessary processes. Again, I recognise that the Department is working on a short time frame, but we must then accept that the proposed legislation is not likely to be at the desired standard that is achieved when the appropriate processes are undergone. I understand that as a piece of emergency legislation, the sunset clause will bring it to an end come November, barring any extensions granted by the Oireachtas. These regulations must remain temporary in nature, especially because in reality they will only be relevant to a very small minority of operators within the licensed trade sector that breach the regulations set in place. I would hope that it would also provide clarity and assurances to licensed traders who will now be allowed to open soon. The Minister appears to have recognised the excuse of keeping pubs shut is not valid anymore, given that this legislation would ensure that the pub that do not serve the €9 food to customers that the government deemed essential in the fight against COVID-19 can operate in the same standards and guidelines as those that do. This sector was left behind by government policy and forced to remain out of operation far beyond what was asked of publicans in other parts of Europe. Unfortunately, our pubs have not received the necessary supports up until this point. The Minister of Employment must look immediately to address this issue that will future-proof this sector. I would suggest a once-off grant of $25,000 to each publican to diversify their business. This grant would allow them to put in an alternative source of income, like installing a kitchen, a deli, a coffee shop, an off-licence, accommodation, or any other business that they could derive an income from. Having a functioning business is what keeps the economy going. We must support them in this transition. Currently, Ireland is the only country in Europe that still has the pubs closed. We must remember that many towns and villages across Ireland, the local pub is an important gathering place for local communities. They are a place where communities can come together to celebrate special occasions and holidays, of sporting events, and to have community meetings and other events. While I am not suggesting that these things that should be ongoing in the current climate, it is our duty to ensure that these pubs get the support that they need to open and be active within their communities. The failure of the government to act appropriately could result in the collapse of the sector, and such a loss will be felt in every village and town across the country. I hope this legislation will follow on from that. As I mentioned, the legislation concerns a very small minority of operators within the licensing trade sector. The government continues to pick and choose where to implement legislation such as this bill before us today, rather than focusing on sectors that have proven to be responsible for significant outbreaks of COVID-19, such as the meat factories. It is baffling that the government has yet to take control of that situation. Those factories are still only obliged to adhere to guidelines. The suspension of testing at these meat factories will come back to haunt Nefrit and this government. In fact, all factories where a large number of employees gather for the production of food or any other product are petri dishes for this virus. Such a lack of action only serves to deplete the public's confidence in public health restrictions. I think building public confidence needs to be a priority right now. As our economy slowly opens, it seems that there are some that are still finding it all too easy to forget that COVID-19 remains rampant throughout the world. It can still cause inordinate damage in our health, our economy and our society. We need to continue to remind ourselves of the necessary precautions to take in order to protect ourselves and to combat the risk of rising figures. Let us not forget the sacrifices that we have made already to allow us to get to this point. We do not want to find ourselves in a position as we once found ourselves back in March. It is unthinkable to find ourselves dealing with a second surge of cases, and yet every day the numbers grow increasingly concerning. We now have the knowledge we need in order to proactively manage the threat posed by the virus while allowing our businesses to operate. I am happy that pubs will now join those businesses in operating while at a reduced capacity, but the legislation governing this must be clear, precise and transparent as possible. This is not the case here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.